Great. So thank you for inviting me to speak on this occasion. Today we want to show you some preliminary findings from a survey experiment that we have on acceptance of hydrogen for ferries and ship traffic on the west coast of Norway. The article is still in its early phase, both in terms of getting a complete and good overview of the literature, but also in terms of the analysis. But I think this is a good time to get to present our preliminary results and to get some much needed input on the way ahead. Let me see. So the research questions that we pursue or look into, the first is, to what extent does type of hydrogen production, that is green, blue, and gray hydrogen, influence public perceptions of hydrogen as an alternative energy source? And when we talk about these types of hydrogen, green hydrogen is produced primarily using electricity, which comes from renewable energy sources. So this is emissions free, right? While blue hydrogen uses coal, oil, or natural gas, but you store the CO2 emissions, at least the plants in Norway, to store it under the seabed. So this is carbon capture and storage. So this is practically also emissions free, right? And then the gray hydrogen is produced from coal, oil, natural gas, but then the CO2 emissions are let out into the atmosphere, right? So these are the treatment conditions that we have, and we'll talk much more about that later when we come to the survey experiments. The second research questions we have, or part of this, is that we're interested in knowing whether these views on hydrogen are influenced by people's attitudes towards environmental protection and climate change, their political preferences, or socio-demographic backgrounds. So we ask these questions because, as we all know, interest in hydrogen as a green alternative to fossil fuels has gained interest, has grown significantly. There are massive investments into research and demonstration projects, programs worldwide, including in Norway. So in terms of policy making, it's important to know whether people are supportive or not of hydrogen, as well as the sources of this support. Why are people for or against using this energy source? Also, we know that energy transition projects can be met with public resistance. So it's important to engage the public and those affected by those transitions. And one first step to engage citizens is to ask their opinions and understand their preferences. Yes. I can also mention that explanatory research on the factors influencing hydrogen acceptance is quite limited. And to our knowledge, there's very little research on this in Norway as well. And if people have any studies that they know of, they can please send them to us. But I do want to highlight a few studies that we found and some general findings from these. There are studies, of course, on perceptions of low carbon energy technologies more generally. And in these studies, in broad terms, individuals usually express positive perceptions toward low carbon energy technologies, but then especially renewable energy technologies such as solar and wind power. And there are less positive reactions towards biomass and low carbon fossil fuels technologies such as natural gas, and also technologies that enable us to control fossil fuel emissions, for example, carbon capture and storage, and nuclear energy. Yeah. And carbon capture and storage is, of course, a part of one of our treatments. It's a part of how you produce blue hydrogen. So this is, to us, interesting that this, in general, has less support than renewable energy sources. When it comes to hydrogen specifically, individuals are, in the surveys and research that has been conducted previously, individuals are generally supportive of hydrogen technology. Citizens environmental concerns, their trust in technology, and increased knowledge and awareness tend to increase their acceptance of hydrogen. Also, those who have a higher education, males and the young, have stronger support for hydrogen. But we also see in all of these studies that hydrogen is a large unknown and unfamiliar issue for most people. So this raises some doubts about the effectiveness and appropriateness of survey research, right? We think that instead of focusing directly on the technology but rather on the production of hydrogen and how it's produced, we limit this problem, because we expect most people to have quite informed opinions about environmental consequences of using renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels. So this research is a part of a large pilot project, which is called Liquid Hydrogen to Decarbonize Maritime Transport in Norway. This is a project led by BKK in cooperation with many industry partners and also research partners from NORCE and others. And it's funded by the Research Council and by the industry partners. And the aim and goal of this project is to develop, build, and operate the liquid hydrogen value chain for ships and ferries at the west coast of Norway. So when we ask these broad questions we ask about hydrogen production, is we ask them in the setting of using hydrogen for maritime transport on the west coast of Norway. And in this project, there's a work package on social acceptance where we conduct case studies and survey research. The case studies are conducted mostly in the areas where there are loading stations for hydrogen or where these ferries will run. And the survey research is more broad and looks at the views on the general public about hydrogen for ships and ferries. And this is what we're presenting today, the broad survey research. So we have collected survey data through the Norwegian Citizen Panel in round 19, which was this fall. In this round, a general question was included by Kristin Frøysa and Trygve Skjold, which read, do you have a positive or negative impression of hydrogen as a fuel for ferries and passenger ships? This was asked to about 2,500 respondents. And then Jon Kåre and I included a survey experiment as well, which is designed to study the effect of hydrogen production, green, blue, or gray, on citizen acceptance of hydrogen. And this was answered by almost 1,900 or a little over 1,900 respondents. So first, if we look at the general question, we see that most citizens are positive to hydrogen. They answer that they are, a majority of respondents answer that they are slightly positive, very positive. And we see that over 30% say that they are positive to using hydrogen as a fuel source for ferries and passenger ships. There's only a very small proportion of these respondents that are negative to using hydrogen. I think less than 10% say that they are very negative, or slightly negative. But we also see, as previous studies have shown, that many have an indifferent opinion, neither positive nor negative, or no opinion at all. It's about 35% that said that they are neither positive nor negative, or no opinion. So this finding is similar to those in existing literature, right? Then we have looked a little bit, tried to have some initial analysis of who is more or less negative. And we run just an initial OLS regression where we include education, gender, and age. And we see that for education, when you compare university college education to no education, there are no statistically significant difference between those groups. When you compare upper secondary education to no education or primary school, there's also not a statistically significant difference. Also for age, those born, when we compare to those born earlier in 1960, there's no difference in opinion in opinion of hydrogen for those born in 1990 or later, or between 1960 and 1989. So age doesn't seem to have an influence on whether you have a positive or negative influence on hydrogen. I can mention that for age, we have a bit few respondents on this the category that we are comparing to. So I might explain the high level or the confidence level. So, but still, we can't find any significant effect there. We do find, however, that men have a more positive view towards hydrogen than women. We have also conducted some initial analysis of who it is that don't have an opinion, and we know from those analyses that are included here that men are more likely than women to have an opinion about hydrogen at all. So this finding is similar to findings in existing literature, that men are more likely than women to be aware of hydrogen and that they show higher acceptance of hydrogen technology. And we don't really know why. The literature doesn't really get into, at least what I've read, doesn't really get into why this is the case. We have some hypotheses. It might have to do with career paths. Maybe there are more men in energy jobs. It could have something to do with risk aversion, that men are more willing to take risks and therefore accepts hydrogen technology more. And there's also a large literature on political knowledge showing a gender gap in political knowledge. So this might be something that could explain why women are less aware of hydrogen. But these are just hypotheses. We don't know, and any suggestions from the audience are, of course, welcome. So we move on to the survey experiment. So for those of you unfamiliar with survey experiment, this is a way to separate groups of respondents within a survey into different treatment conditions. So as researchers, we would randomly assign participants to at least 2 experimental conditions, and the researcher treats these conditions differently. And due to this random assignment, we can assume that the difference between these conditions is the difference in treatment, right? So a classic example is the testing of a new medicine. You give a pill with the medicine to one group and you give a sugar pill to the other group, and the difference in outcome between these groups is the effect of the medicine. And we can do this similarly in surveys. So in our survey, all respondents are exposed to the following text. So hydrogen is an alternative fuel source for shipping in Norway. Among other things, hydrogen will be used to power Norway's first hydrogen ferry, which will operate for Norway on the Elverum connection from 2021. And hydrogen can be produced in different ways. And then the first third of respondents, so 1/3 of respondents, are randomly assigned to this gray treatment, which reads, so-called gray hydrogen uses coal, oil, or natural gas, which means that the process of producing hydrogen generates large CO2 emissions. The second third of respondents are assigned to the blue treatment, which reads, so-called blue hydrogen uses coal, oil, or natural gas, but the CO2 gas is separated from the hydrogen and returned to where it came from. In Norway, this means storing CO2 under the seabed on the continental shelf. And finally, the last third of respondents are assigned to the green treatment, reading, so-called green hydrogen is produced from electricity primarily generated from renewable energy sources, which generally does not involve any emissions of CO2. And in the end, all respondents answer the following question. To what extent do you think it's acceptable that shipping traffic in Norway is powered by hydrogen produced in this way? So either gray, blue, or green. And they answer the question on a scale from 1, not acceptable at all, and to 5, to a very large extent. So if we first look at acceptability of hydrogen use among groups, we see that for those given the green treatment, most of them have a high acceptance of using green hydrogen. So more than 40% of the respondents said that they would accept the use of green hydrogen to a large extent. Right? If we look at those given the blue treatment, over 40% of them would support using hydrogen to some extent. And those given the gray treatment, close to 40% would support using hydrogen to a small extent. And we also see that very few would support gray hydrogen to a large extent, and very few would support green hydrogen at all. Like they say that not acceptable. Right. So overall, I think this shows that people have a high acceptance of green hydrogen and a moderate acceptance of blue hydrogen, and very little acceptance of gray hydrogen. And this is also reflected on the average. So here we look at the average levels of acceptance across treatment groups. We see that for green, those in the green treatment, they accept level of acceptance is 3.9, which is to a large extent, right? And the average acceptance of the blue hydrogen is to some extent, about 3.2. And average acceptance of gray hydrogen is 2.3, which is to a small extent. And on the right-hand side, when we look at effect sizes, when we compare green and blue hydrogen to gray hydrogen, on the scale from 1 to 5, there's 1.6 difference between treatment groups, green and gray. And there's 0.9 difference or higher acceptance of blue versus gray. The difference between of acceptability between green and blue is 0.7, which is also statistically significant. So they prefer green over blue and blue over gray. And I think, given that the level of support for acceptance for gray hydrogen is the average is to a small extent, I think it's quite safe to say that very few show any support or any high support for gray hydrogen. And then we look at levels of acceptance for different groups of respondents. We look at education, gender, age, and political preferences. And when it comes to education, citizens' acceptance for green, blue, and gray are fairly similar across those levels of education. So you see for the gray hydrogen, acceptance is quite low, but there are no significant differences between education levels. So the education levels that we are included is no education or elementary school, university or university college, and upper secondary education. The same is true within the blue treatment group. There are no difference, no significant difference between education levels for those in the blue condition as well as for the green. So we do not find any effect so far on education, which is not the same as I think in previous literature they found some education effects, but we don't find it here on acceptance. When we look at gender, we see that for both within the gray condition and within the blue, there are differences between men and women, where women show a lower acceptance for blue and gray hydrogen. I think that women are less supportive of gray and blue speaks to a more general finding in the literature that women on average will express higher concerns about the environment and are more likely to act pro-environmentally than men. So then they react more negatively when hydrogen is not produced emissions-free, or when the production of hydrogen includes, for example, a further use of fossil fuels, so carbon capture and storage. Finally, we see that the youngest citizens have a statistically significantly higher acceptance for green hydrogen compared to the oldest citizens, those born in 1959 or earlier. And this is the only statistically significant finding we have for age. But the younger seem they have a very high acceptance rate for green hydrogen. And there is some, but it's not statistically significant, so some movement across individuals' political preferences. So on the x-axis, we have an 11-point scale from 0, which is on the left-hand side of politics, and to 11, which is you place yourself on the right side of politics. And if we look at the gray treatment condition, we see that acceptance for using gray hydrogen increases as further as we get to the right. And this actually decreases, and the use of blue and green hydrogen decreases as far as we get to the right. But these effects or differences are not statistically significant. But there are some indications that political preferences has an influence. I think the next step is to analyze party affiliation. So the conclusion is that people are generally positive towards hydrogen, but many have no opinion or are indifferent. And this is in line with previous research on this. We also see that men are more positive than women to the use of hydrogen on ferries. People support green and blue hydrogen, but not gray. And they prefer green over blue and blue over gray, of course. And I think it's interesting to see that people prefer green over blue. I think there's an indication in the data. I haven't showed we haven't showed it here, but if you compare the distribution on the answers to the general question about how positive you are to hydrogen with the distributions on the in the survey experiment, these are very similar. The green treatment group answers in the green treatment group is very similar to answers on the general questions. So this indicates that people seem to have or to perceive hydrogen as green on the outset. So that when you give them any indications that of the opposite, that hydrogen is either gray or that it's blue, then this leads to less support. It doesn't represent a complete move away from fossil fuels. There might also be something with carbon capture and storage. We know from the existing literature that technologies like that, like carbon capture and storage, are less supported than renewable energies. So that might be why people prefer green over blue. Also, we've been thinking about the question wording. When we present the green treatment, this is very green and it's very clear that this is emissions free. And when we present the blue treatment, maybe we should, I'm not sure if people perceive this as emission free as well. So we could have balanced this a bit more and included a sentence in the blue treatment, and this is emission free as well. And then the differences between green and blue might not have been as large. Finally, women are less supportive of gray and blue hydrogen than men, and the younger are more supportive of green than the older citizens. And overall, since we know that women and young people generally, or on average, are more concerned about the environment, I think this finding suggests that environmental concerns at least influences hydrogen acceptance here as well. And the next step for me on Core is to include more an analysis of the more general questions about climate attitudes in the citizen panel into this study as well. Yes, this is what I had so far, and I look forward to your questions and comments.